Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to this wonderful SQAB tutorial on a selective introduction to organic evolution for non-biologists, presented by Dr. Paul Andronis. I've known Paul now for 30 years. I met him when I was 3 years old. If you believe that. We were at a university together in Western Illinois, and Paul was out traipsing around trying to find little slugs or something in the water for some type of biology project. I remember that distinctly. And that is important because from the time I met him until the current time, he has been a student of evolution and evolutionary theory. He graduated with a BS degree in biology, then went on and got an MS degree in zoology and microbiology and evolutionary theory. He then proceeded to go on to the University of Chicago, where he got both a master's degrees and PhDs in biopsychology. And we both had the distinct privilege of being at the University of Chicago together, and at the time studying with Israel Golddiamond, as well as many people in the biopsychology curriculum and committee, which was heavily influenced by Eckhart Hess and many other the ethologists and evolutionary theorists at the university. In the early 1980s, Paul, along with Israel Golddiamond, was basically hired by the National Science Foundation to provide a series of workshops on behavior and genetic programming and genetic environmental variables for the Chautauqua short course series throughout the country. And from that arose a great deal of work and interest in the interactions between evolutionary biological systems and selection by consequences. And that has basically defined Paul's work through the rest of, up until the present time and through those years. I couldn't be more pleased and honored to present Paul. I know of no one who knows evolutionary theory nor its relation to behavior analysis as well as he does. It is a tremendous privilege to introduce Paul Andronis.
Thanks, Joe. Joe, I need that. Hi, Joe. I need my pad and the outline. Is the outline under there? Yeah. Thank you, Joe. The check will be in your room when you get through. I have to pay friends to say nice things. They know better. I got the call to do this a couple of weeks ago and agreed to do it before I even gave it any thought about how difficult the task this was going to be, to talk about a topic as complex, as broad-based, as deep, and as controversial as evolutionary theory. And it is all those things and more. I think one of the things that is really striking is the sort of lionization of Darwin. This is a Levine caricature, and this is essentially a metaphor for what this presentation is going to be, because there are only 50 minutes to try to cover an awful lot of ground, and so it's going to be very highly selective in the sense that I do the selection. I'll pick the topics that I think are the ones that have interested me, that I think are important and crucial to the overall picture of what evolutionary theory is about, and the ones that also should suggest to you that if you're really interested in the entire issue, that it really does take some more study. What was interesting to me about this, aside from the little worker's cap with the hammer and sickle fashioned with a microscope, is the portrait of Darwin that, in fact, Joe and I were talking about. One of the problems of having a close friend who's also interested in the same field is we end up reading a lot of the same books and recommending books to each other, and so when we talk, we end up doing it like in a shorthand, and as soon as each of us knows exactly where the other one is gone, the conversation ends on that topic, and we go on to other things. And it's interesting because he said, that's a picture of Darwin the way he's usually portrayed as an old man, but when he did this work, he was really young. Yeah, but that's not the Darwin that everybody remembers. It's not the naturalist. It's not the active scientist who, the act of creating this edifice of evolutionary theory was the really brilliant part. What we generally talk about is all the wisdom embedded in it and so on. The Origin of Species is a really fine book, but it's not something that you ought to read for its current value. It's a great outline. It introduces the main concepts. It introduces, in fact, the things that have been and continue to be the underpinning for evolutionary biology to this day. But frankly, he got a lot of it wrong and sketched in a lot of things that ended up not necessarily according with more modern data. And that's okay. If his theory didn't change over the years, then in the first place it probably wouldn't have been a very good one. The reason I also like this portrait, and this is, actually let me, I'm going to have to get used to doing these two things. I feel like Dick Malott in the early days with his multimedia presentations. Darwin's theory, it's an evolutionary theory in the sense that it treats what we in modern terms call evolution. But in Darwin's day, evolution was really what we consider revolutionary now, and revolution is what he was really referring to, that it was essentially his model was descent with modification, and that was something that wasn't necessarily contentious. Evolution had been around for a long time. His grandfather Erasmus had in fact tried to fashion a model of evolution years before. Aristotle, if you look at Aristotle's writings on biology and animals, he has sections on evolution. So evolution itself wasn't really the issue. It was evolution through the process of natural selection. That was really Darwin's main contribution, was the idea that nature somehow selected the species as they lived, and that what remained were things that survived this natural selection. The metaphor of selection, I will tell you right now that Darwin got it. This, by the way, is from Levy's book. These aren't pigeons that Darwin would have seen. These are American breeds, but Darwin really got in part the idea for natural selection by thinking about how breeders, selective breeders, pick and choose the features that they want to maintain in species that they're breeding, and create all sorts of variations that by the time, and this barely looks like a pigeon, and this looks like Mae West with, I'm not even sure. If you've ever seen some of the fancy pigeon breeds, I managed to go to the UP State Fair up near our home, and I look at some of the fancy pigeon breeds, and they look like lethal mutants. They aren't going to last, and the breeders breed them true. Darwin looked at this and said, this in some way is what nature does on a natural scale. It picks and chooses for whatever reasons various strains. Those characteristics are passed on to offspring who keep reproducing them, and others are culled out. The breeder takes some of the animals out of the breeding pool, and so their characteristics don't show up in subsequent generations. If you look, aside from this big belly, if we take this head and put it about here, and we take these legs, chop them off here, put these legs on here, you have what looks like pretty much a silver king or a rock dove, depending on the size and so on. And so you can see the conservation of some characters, the blending of others, and so on. That's what Darwin assumed was going on in evolution. In a sense, it was nature doing the selection. The subtitle of the book was, in fact, the main title was The Origin of Species, although he had very little to say about the origin of species. He didn't talk about speciation very much. Part of the reason for that, and this is a sort of a segue into a recurrent theme in this talk, and that is that evolutionary theory really is a social construct that has social consequences. Well, if you think of it as verbal behavior, of course it has social consequences, and of course it's a social construct. The fact is that the reason Darwin didn't want to say much about the origin of species was that among professional biologists at the time, that was a hot topic that would have gotten this theory crushed by itself. As it was, with the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, it wasn't the contention that evolution had occurred that biologists argued with. In fact, the general public said, of course this is what happened. The general public, the lay public, educated people in other areas said, this makes sense. And in fact, assumed that scientists agreed. Professional biologists, on the other hand, including very influential people like Louis Agassiz and a number of others who made a living at doing professional biology, had a big investment in something called the fixity of species. And so this approach, in a sense, said that yeah, species change over time, except that whatever species are here now are just latter-day representatives of earlier species, and so the number of species essentially stays the same, and what we see is a successive modification of these species. It's essentially concordant with the idea that everything that's alive right now was created right at the beginning, and that the only thing that's happened now is they've gotten better. As the world has changed, they've gotten better adjusted to the changes in the world, but all of them have been there from the start. Now that presents real problems to a theory of evolution like Darwin's, because Darwin said these things got created essentially through descent with modification, and he intimated that in fact species had been transformed. He envisioned it as a gradual accretion of very small changes over geological time, and when you get enough of them, you get a new organism. Okay, that's one thing that Darwin's probably wrong about. But it was something that he didn't hit hard on because he wanted the idea of nature doing selection to catch hold, and of course, to whatever extent it challenged the way that the bread and butter biologists at the time made a living, it wasn't accepted. Eventually, people got the idea. In fact, it was when the people who made a living at this stuff essentially died off and their students couldn't make a living at it anymore, they began agreeing with Darwin. So you get to a period early in the 20th century. These are quotes from Dobzhansky, who was a geneticist at Columbia University who studied with Morgan. The first quote, I think, is something that he was essentially forewarning biology teachers that if you're going to teach a biology course, if you don't teach evolution, none of it's going to make any sense whatsoever. And so it has to be an integral part because that is a fact of biology. And the other stuff only makes sense if you look at it in terms of its evolutionary relations. And then he gave what I think is a pretty good, but also a sort of a socially interesting description of what evolution is, because it sort of sets the stage for where some of the 20th century arguments have been. Organic evolution is a series of partial or complete and irreversible transformations of the genetic composition of populations based principally upon altered interactions with the environment. Okay, now it's a nice description, and it seems to be sort of incontrovertible that, of course, genetic composition of populations are changed, and that by and large those changes are occurring through altered interactions with the environment, but it doesn't really say what's interacting with the environment. The implication is that the genes themselves are interacting with the environment, and it's sort of hidden in the statement, but it's there. It's not. Dobzhansky is pretty careful about his choice of words. It consists chiefly of adaptive radiations into new environments, adjustments to environmental changes that take place in particular habitat, and the origin of new ways for exploiting existing habitats. These adaptive changes occasionally give rise to greater complexity of developmental pattern, of physiological reactions, and of the interactions between populations and their environment. Notice there is nowhere the mention of an individual organism there. It's all in terms of populations. Okay? That's sort of the resolution of what was called the new synthesis in the 1930s. Psychology students, anybody who's majored in psychology and had to take statistics will know the name Fisher through the Fisher-Exact test and the F-test and all these other things. Fisher was really the one who provided the impetus for the new synthesis, because with his description of population statistics, he gave the geneticists the tools to actually analyze the behavior of the flow of genes through populations to be able to predict probabilities, and in fact created what was essentially a sort of a statistical description of evolutionary outcomes that took individuals right out of the picture. One of the other problems with that is that as soon as you begin looking at organisms, or at the sort of characteristic organisms, these pigeon breeds aren't really organisms. They are the incidental representation of a probability cloud of characteristics that we can measure through these beautiful statistics, and that this is one of those ugly facts that crops up to throw your nice theories around. But by and large, the new synthesis took the individual out of the equation, and all of it was couched in this language about populations. Okay, now that's a real departure from what Darwin did, because if you remember what Darwin did, he crated up specimens of bugs and snails and bird pelts and all sorts of other things, real, honest-to-God, tangible, smelly objects, and had them shipped back to England. He went through museum drawers and counted up the number of hackles on feathers of different parts of birds. He looked at the number of wrinkles in a piece of chitin on a beetle's back and looked at patterns. In other words, the naturalists look at individuals as the grist of evolution. Population biologists in the 30s especially, but the new synthesis people essentially co-opted the entire field and turned it into this sort of population picture. Now, I'm going to very quickly also mention that Darwin didn't confine himself to simple physical traits. This is chapter 3 from the second part of most editions of The Origins of Species. Also has the second section, The Descent of Man. And in that chapter 3, he talks about a comparison of the mental powers of man and lower animals. And he talks about some of the complex human functions and looks for their rudiments in animal behavior. And essentially talks about in addition to the homology of physical characteristics, that behavior probably has real evolutionary homologies, and that we can look at them with the same sort of high-power biological perspective that we apply to physical characteristics. We can also do this with the emotional and the intellectual, and in general sense, the behavioral characteristics, and it continues to this day. I mean, take a look at, this is a paper from about 9 years ago now, but we're grafting this human idea of object permanence, and we're looking for it in a parrot. Now, I'm not saying anything about this work because I think this is really interesting work, but it also suggests that going back to our idea about Darwin's theory being a social construct, here we are applying one social construct, this idea of stages of development because of the particular developmental tests we do, because of the particular social constructs in the psychological theory. We're now grafting those on to a biological construct theory and trying to make sense out of them. This sort of characteristic, I'm going to show you one other. This is one of my favorite cartoons that I showed a few years back, but this is sort of a blending of all those. There's the caption says, "The rooster stared back at me, his power and confidence almost overwhelming. Down below, a female paused warily at the coop's entrance. I kept the camera running. They were beautiful, these chickens in the mist." We tend to look for things that are like what we do in organisms that are like us, and then we either deny the possibility that parrots can show object permanence, or that pigeons can show stimulus equivalence, or that dolphins, just because they have really big brains, may not be any smarter than your average German Shepherd, but we're surprised they're that smart because they look like fish instead of dogs. We tend to take these various concepts, and depending on how familiar or how plausible the explanations seem in terms of social constructs we've brought in from other areas, we blend them together to make accounts in nature that very often don't make sense. And I'm going to come back to that point in a few minutes, but I'll show you another way in which some of these social constructs are embedded. Here's just a brief diagram on the early evolution of life, and it starts with about 4,500 million years ago. If you notice way at the bottom, there's this sort of coacervate particle. It's just a conglomeration of chemicals that, one reason or another, are partitioned from the rest of the environment, and somehow that partitioned material can create more partitioned materials, or there are more partitioned materials created like it. There are some really interesting theories about how that early stage of life was generated, but the important thing is the partitioning, the isolation of that unit from other parts of the chemical environment. Instead of being just a big mixed soup, in order for you to trace the lineage of any of this stuff, there has to be some way of partitioning that from the background. And so the ground is all the rest of the atmosphere, and the field, or the the object, these particles then, began being transformed in the way that Darwin envisioned. And you get to the point where you have cellular objects where there are relatively complex chemical reactions carried on. They become more specialized cells. They develop various competencies all the way up through, in what looks like a linear fashion, the origin of more complex creatures. You have what's called the Cambrian explosion, where you have a whole bunch of different complex organisms being created at one time. That there are estimates that there may have been as many as 25, 27, some people's count 39 different phyla of organisms that then got winnowed down to the about 5 to 7 that we currently recognize as individual phyla. But if you look, each era is characterized by particular kinds of fish. 500 million years ago, the agnathid fish, the jawless fish appeared, and vertebrates appeared. You started getting ferns and land plants about 435 million years ago, and fish with jaws began appearing. Now, they didn't just suddenly come out of nowhere. Fish with jaws, the jaw essentially was a borrowed element from the gills in the jawless fish, where there were 9 gill slits originally. Some of these things actually ended up migrating and provided support for a flap that allowed the animal to ingest other things. Gradual transformation of elements that were already there, you lead to armored jawed fish. Land arthropods start occurring. Amphibia occur. Reptiles, you start getting a radiation of the reptiles. You get to the point up here where Jurassic Park is taking place in the Triassic. Way down here, somewhere in this 180 to 135 million year ago period, mammals appeared as a distinct group, distinct from the reptiles. And that's really our origins as a group separate from the dinosaurs. And it also seems to have been a time when some of the other body plans, you can see here an Archaeopteryx and a Pteranodon, and this dinosaur porpoise. I mean, these things were very different. You see a chart like this of evolution, and it looks like things just disappeared and were replaced by a whole new plan. In reality, that's one way of looking at it, that the old is supplanted by the new. But in reality, for most of these creatures, they didn't die out. That form died out, but their progeny, in slightly changed forms, kept producing more genes that provided the variations, and gradually these things were transformed into other things, with the exception of some of the big dinosaurs that were dead ends. Most of those plans, in one way or another, survived. In fact, there is some conjecture that dinosaurs are represented in modern-day animals by the birds themselves, that the birds, especially the ornithischians, the ones that have bird-like pelvises, is a whole separate group of the dinosaurs that includes most of the raptorial forms and most of the big carnivores. Those have pelvises a lot like the birds, and there's a good chance that the birds represent what's left of these dinosaurs. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that this is often portrayed as a replacement sequentially by lines. If you look at a slightly different way, this is more of a two-dimensional picture than the sort of one-dimensional sequential fit. If you look early on at some of the earliest forms, we're talking about 700 million years ago, that there were organisms that had repeating segments. Seriated protocoelomates means basically that there's a series of repeated parts. Now, that's really easy. All you have to do during your reproduction would be, just like the two-headed calf you used to see at Riverview here in Chicago, is when different parts of the embryo begin forming, or different parts of the eggs begin forming and are ready to split, you reproduce the part, but you don't split them apart. And so these repeated parts were actually organisms that sort of stuck together and created one organism with repeated parts. Now, that's fairly easy to do. All you have to do is screw around with one particular set of regulator genes to keep the division from occurring. Anyway, this gave rise to, here it's shown there are about 5 different basic kinds of worms. If you look at them, they aren't terribly different. But at this early stage, there are some fairly simple differences between them. A pseudometamerous means that it looks like there are these repeated sections, but they aren't really repeated. That parts of the sections are repeated, but other parts aren't. Amerous means that there aren't segments. It's a group that lost this seriation. There are others that have feeding structures attached and have a slightly different order of the laying down of the different parts and so on. But each one of these then gave rise to groups that we see as very different. The molluscans, the mollusks. If you look over here, brachiopods and a whole mess of extinct phyla. Here is our lineage. So this is probably one of our greatly distant ancestors. Looks like a little sea cucumber. And the annelids and the arthropods. Now, what I want to show you is that at this point, there isn't a great difference between the ancestors. At an early stage, it didn't take a big change. All you needed to do was change one essential part of the bowel plan. But in doing that, it then constrains all of the things that can follow. This is a different picture of the descent that was portrayed in the other lineage, where all you see is the main themes picked out: the age of the dinosaurs, the age of the mammals, the age of the reptiles, the age of the amphibia, and so on. People characterize those things and, in fact, describe them as a succession. We talk about them in a succession. And so one of the things that was grafted onto Darwin's theory back in the 19th century, and in fact continues into the 20th century, is the idea of progressive evolution. That each of these bowel plans represent an improvement of some sort. And it is really a progression of evolutionary change in the sense of progress, that there's a moving forward to more complexity and to more successful adaptation and so on. That's been one of the points of contention. One of the things that you'll find is that evolution is extremely conservative. This, I thought, might be relevant to psychologists, as interested as we are in behavior and how we are so culturally prone to put behavior in the brain. I thought I would just show you sort of the progression that people talk about. This is a vertebrate embryo brain. Now, the reason it says vertebrate embryo instead of any particular species is that for the most part, in the embryonic form, in early development, each of these phyla look very, all of the members of the phylum look very similar at early stages of embryogenesis. Remember, we said that if you looked at that other phylogeny, those various worms that led to the different major groups looked pretty much alike. There were minor differences, but they looked alike. What we find is that most vertebrate brains have just little outpouchings for the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain that look pretty similar. And then as you get various stages of development occurring, or various points in the developmental sequence, things turn on and off in different orders. Things that are turned on stay on a little longer in some species. And so you start to get a change in the way things look based on very small embryogenic changes. That's, in essence, where much of evolutionary change takes place, is in embryogenesis. In particular events, early on in development will lead to vastly different organisms. So you can see here are 4 main groups of vertebrates, for example, the fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And if you look, the brains look like circus mirror versions of each other. You take this model of the brain and you hold it up to the circus mirror at one point, and then you move it down here and one part grows big. You've seen those things. And essentially, that's what is going on with some of the regulator genes, and that may in fact be all that accounts for the differences between some of these major groups, or minor early changes in the regulator genes that change the whole bowel plan of further development. Does it mean there are no differences? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that with minimal genetic differences, you can get really major differences in the organisms. Now, Darwin never knew about how this thing was going to get conserved, and so one of the things that gave Darwin's work its big boost in the 20th century was the rediscovery of Mendel, and I intimated that genetics became important in the 30s. It was really the rediscovery of Mendel, the discovery of genes, the idea that there are characteristics, physical characteristics of the organism that are somehow conserved by these genes, that really led to a regrowth of interest in what's going on in evolution. It gave us essentially part of the major leg. I'll jump ahead here to the main elements of the modern theory. These are really the elements that Darwin talked about, and they are variation, that you get variability in the organisms. Okay? Even within a generation, animals of the same species will have slightly different coats. Their order of spots might be a little different. Some may be a little different sizes. There's variability. They hang out in slightly different places. They look for different things in their mates. They make different sounds depending on where they are. There are all sorts of variations in these animals, and the ones that we now know are important, the sources of those things are things that Darwin didn't know about at the time. And so these things, many of these things, we only began to recognize well into the 20th century. Darwin didn't need the genetics to describe what was happening at the selection end. Okay, he was looking at the selection of organisms, the interaction between the whole organism and its environment, and he didn't need to know what genes were doing. That, like Skinner's insistence that we don't need to know what's happening at the cellular level to explain the effects of selective contingencies in behavior, Darwin said at the time, I don't know how these traits are retained, but this is what's going on. You know, somebody's going to figure this out eventually. Mutation is an actual change. It's a substantive change in the genes, in the genetic makeup of the organism, in the mechanism for retention. And it's generally thought of as being spontaneous. It's not something that is part of the normal turning on and off of genes in that sense. In a sense, most mutation is considered to be accidental or incidental to the normal life of the genetic material. Genes can be recombined, and through that recombination express different combinatorial effects. Two genes that are combined one way may produce one outcome, and when those same two genes are associated with other elements and their effects occur together, they produce completely separate effects. There was also something identified called genetic drift. Within populations, some genes just change. Part of it is mutation, but it's considered to be a sort of a random process that has no selective consequences. In other words, it's an effect of random mutation in the background, and because it has no genetic or no biological consequences for the organism, it sort of wanders around in the population. It's called genetic drift. Now, it doesn't mean it can't have an effect, but if it's considered drift, it means that it's just normal variability in the gene pool, and these are things that aren't tightly constrained by natural selection. We've learned a lot about variability, and I am not going to talk about the molecular genetics in detail, but understand that when we talk about mutations, most of the time we're talking about a change of a single element in the genetic code. And by that, I mean each, well, let me very quickly run this down for you. This is the actual material. That's the genetic material. This is DNA, and it's a long double helix that is, each of the helices are held together by pairs of what are called bases, and they come in two varieties, oh God, I'm blocking now. Purines and pyrimidines. They come in these two varieties, and they're paired up in very specific ways. Adenine with thymine, guanine with cytosine. they pair up in very specific ways, and they constitute in a sequence along each of these helices. That's the code. Now, this isn't a code for an arm or a leg, by the way. It's a code for an amino acid. And I'll show you very quickly the way these things work, because DNA, the genetic template, reproduces another molecule which reads each of these little triplets of bases as an individual code. The RNA brings a specific amino acid into play that binds with particular points along this. It strings the amino acids together and creates proteins, and that's all the genes do. I mean, in a real sense, they create sequences of amino acids which, as you see, each time one of these amino acids is brought into play, the RNA detaches. It attaches it to the growing string of amino acids. The next one comes in and is attached to the bunch, and you get a growing chain of amino acids until you get a protein. Now, proteins make up a lot of the workforce of the cells. They are structural. They are recognition molecules in the membranes, for example. Gerald Edelman has a whole explication of the role of topographic development of organisms based on surface recognition phenomena, where proteins actually bind with other proteins of specific kinds, and which cells form in close contact with others is going to depend on which recognition proteins they have. And so proteins take on a very important role in the regulation of development, but there's no arm or leg in that gene. Okay, the arm or the leg is in the program of expressing those genes, and that's conserved by the overall outcome, the coherent project at the end of all this DNA and RNA transcription and the translation into proteins and the assembly of cells with slightly different surfaces, and they roll over each other and they recombine, and parts of them grow faster than others. And at the end of all this, you get a mouse or a deer tick or a human being, and the whole enterprise gets carried along. Let me show you how complicated. I don't really want to go into detail on this stuff because it's way too complicated. You can take an entire course. But this is the genetic code back here, okay? Way back here. This is what the genes are. They're basically DNA. They are transcribed into RNA, and then the RNA synthesizes proteins, but part of the expression, which genes get turned on, when, for how long, in conjunction with other things, when will they turn off, is in part a function of regulator genes, which are other ones that create proteins, which, when the byproducts of another reaction build up far enough, these go over and inhibit that segment of DNA. It gets extremely complex, and that's just to get to proteins. Okay? By the time you go through the growth of specific parts of this embryo, by the time you get to the kinds of interactions between the onset and offset of the genome and the outside environment, like in some fishes, the germs of some fishes or the cells of some fish will allow fish to become either male or female depending on the population density of other members of the same sex. Same thing with amphibians. The adult genes will be expressed as a function of an interaction between those genes and others, and it can completely change the organism in probably a most important way. Once you get this organogenesis, by the time you get to final morphological characters like eye color and the size of your muscles and the power of your brain and all these other things, it's a long way to Tipperary. There's an awful lot going on in between. Now, what that means is that evolution is going to be very conservative. You don't want to keep reinventing the wheel, and so many of these things aren't going to vary very much. And in fact, when we look at rates of evolution, things that are so important that if you screw them up, none of the rest of it happens, become really pretty invariant. They have very low rates of spontaneous change, and usually when you see spontaneous change, there is enough redundancy in the system that, yeah, you get mutation, but it's usually a silent mutation, or if it's not silent, it's lethal. Very rarely do you get a real adaptive mutation, something that really creates something new. Leads us to one of the problem areas. When we talk about adaptation, here's what we're talking about with adaptation. We're talking about a sort of fine-tuning of the basic bowel plan to the environmental problems posed for individuals of a given species. And what you end up with are this basic 1, 2, 5 character of the main bones, or sets of bones that are in most tetrapods. You get 4 limbs on these organisms. There's biradial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. You get a forelimb that gets differentiated different ways depending on the problems. You've got part of this structure, if you look, you've got a humerus, an ulna, and a radius, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges back here. They get expressed in different ways in these different species. And so with the mole, you get a digging, spade-like forearm, a very great, if you look, there's a really big increase in the size of the ulna that provides a strong place for big muscles to get in, to push dirt aside. On the bat, you get very gracile bones. You get, in fact, long, slender bones, just like in birds. It really saves a lot of weight. And the phalanges are greatly extended with skin in between them for an airfoil. And so you get the hand becoming the wing on a bat. With the wolf and with other quadrupeds that actually walk on 4, with no special tasks, you get mainly a support. And if you look, this system doesn't look terribly different from the elephant system except for the actual alignment of the bones, but the basic functions are still there. The seal as a foil to pull it through the water and so on. That's what is meant by adaptation. And that's why Darwin thought of it as a gradual accretive change in the structure of these things. That's all well and good. We can find lots of examples of those, but what do you do? And this, by the way, these are considered to be homology or homologous because they essentially arise the same way during embryogenesis. They are roughly in the same special orientation to one another. We can find forms that show that there's a real phylogenetic relation between them. And so we do call these things homologies, and they're adaptations in the sense that they have very powerful survival consequences for the organisms. Sometimes you get what look like very similar organisms from very different genetic stock, and they converge. This is what's called convergent evolution, and it's what in behavior analysis we would call topographic similarity. These are functionally very different creatures, and in fact, on the left side are placental mammals, on the right are marsupials that are separated by huge geographic areas, but what you can see is that despite the fact that these are very different stock, the specific adaptations within each of these groups took what was there in each of the major groups, in each major bowel plan, and shaped it. In a sense, the animals survived who had the tools to actually survive in that environment, and they ended up appearing very similar. Tasmanian wolf and the canid wolf, ocelots and native cats. If you look down here, a placental anteater and a marsupial anteater, physically they are confronted with the same kinds of problems, and in order to survive and really exploit the environment in the same way, you have to have some of the same tools. And so convergent evolution is where after lines have diverged sufficiently that there aren't going to be any direct homologies in a lot of these things, and in fact the ancestors were so different from one another, and then all of a sudden you get a convergence of the adaptive features. So the basic bowel plan starts out different, although the adaptation, the fine-grained changes to the environment, actually shape a lot of the same topographic elements. And so you get what look like very closely related animals, but they're genetically very different and unrelated. It's been one of the problems in evolution is to know the actual physical relations. Our closest relatives, the chimps, according to most estimates, are about 99% identical to us in genome. Here's the development of a chimp skull. And what this shows is allometric growth. The top is a fetal skull of a chimp. The second one is a juvenile chimp skull. And you can see that what's happening here is that these areas continue to grow rapidly. but the hind area quits growing so rapidly, especially in through the base of the calvarium, and the jaw begins expanding really rapidly until down below you've got a real slowing of the growth of the calvarium of the brain pan area, and a huge growth of the jaw and teeth and so on. It's really a distortion of the same growth. Again, our circus mirror, that's an infant skull, a human fetus. They are really close. In fact, there's a really striking photograph of a chimp baby that looks just like a human baby. It's got the flesh and hair and everything else. And they look so much alike that you say to yourself, we can't possibly be genetically different by that much. And what you see is that as humans continue to grow, the growth, in a sense, continues to resemble the earliest forms for much longer. In other words, our regulator genes keep the juvenile pattern of development going much longer than in the chimps relative to their lifespan. And so we don't get quite so prognathed, we don't get our jaw jutting out, we don't get the overdevelopment of the teeth, and we get a brain area that in fact develops to a much greater relative size than the others. And that's really something that may be only a few minor regulator genes in terms of the evolutionary change, but the evolutionary consequences are enormous for individuals who have those differences. Now, the reason I bring that up is that when we talk about evolution, one of the things that Darwin talked about was this slow, stately, steady progress. And the problem with that picture is that when you look at both the fossil record, when you look at the molecular data, the rate of evolution can't possibly be constant, or you wouldn't be able to get some of the big changes that you've seen, especially changes that occur in relatively rapid times. The divergence of bats and whales from one another took so far less time than the development of these animals to date from their current ones, that if we extrapolate the current rate of change of these species back at a steady rate, they should have diverged at a much earlier time. They should, and the change should have taken a much longer period of time if it occurred by Darwin's picture of a slow, stately change. Back in the early 70s, in fact, catastrophism in evolutionary change has been around since, again, the 19th century, but Eldridge and Gould talked about something called punctuated equilibria, that evolutionary change is, for the most part, a picture of stasis, that for long periods of time organisms don't change, at least the detectable populations that we see don't change that dramatically. We don't have every instant a new species just cropping up. And in fact, the fossil record bears that out, that for long periods of time organisms change very little, but every so often there's a dramatic change in species that acts almost like a punctuation mark in its natural history, and once that change occurs, then the evolution is set off in a different direction, and it's often very rapid, and in evolutionary terms it's a very sudden one. And so they envision, or they picture evolution as occurring in fits and starts. And this has been a real point of contention in evolutionary theory. People have argued about this. I'll show you some of the other arguments that have taken place. Within biology, some of these arguments, and I call them growling points rather than simply growing points, because people spend a lot more time growling at each other than engaging in really constructive discourse. But within biology, there continues to be this units of selection debate. Now, this goes back to the 1930s at least, when I said the population biologists decided that individuals probably really didn't count, so that they weren't the units of selection. It was really the population that was the unit of selection. We have sociobiology that tells us what you experience in your life really doesn't matter much. It's what our species has. The reason guys philander is because it's good for the whole group to have philandering men. All sorts of sort of spurious selectionist arguments made on the basis of a unit of selection that really doesn't exist. It's a construct in a mathematical sense. A question of the species. What is a species? Is there any real biological entity that's a species? And it's a real problem, because if you look at the statistical picture of what defines these characteristics and so on, the species lines blur dramatically. The other side of that population biology battle, by the way, isn't really people who are anti-mathematics or anything else, but they are people who are naturalists who look at the organism in its natural context. You can't sit in a laboratory with a computer and crunch numbers and expect that to capture the richness of what Darwin was looking at when he came up with the theory in the first place. You have to look at the organisms in context. It's comparable, in a sense, to the kind of reductionism in psychology where if we just know what neurotransmitters are in what part of the brain, we can predict what this person's going to do when they're confronted with this next calculus test. And someday we'll be able to give them a molecule that goes to a particular part of the brain, and in the morning when they wake up, they'll be able to solve this integral equation. Okay? That's the form of reductionism, essentially, that the new synthesis people are, in the sense of evolution being driven by gene probabilities without any regard for the natural history. The species question in terms of the natural historians is, of course there are real species, even though they may be ephemeral, even though a species may be constantly changing, even though at the boundaries they may not be different. There are very real species. Speciation occurs when two groups of closely related organisms get separated and accrete enough changes as part of their geographical or reproductive isolation that if you did throw them back together again, they couldn't reproduce. The species question continues to be a thorny one. It's sort of like response definitions and definitions of stimulus control topographies in our field. People continue to argue about them. Pan-selectionism versus neutral theory. Is everything that we have on us the product of natural selection, or is some of it simply biological effects that may or may not have selective consequences, that may change the course of our development? The pan-selectionists claim that everything that's there, anything that's in the genome, is there because it's been actively put there by natural selection. Kimura and a number of people since the 1970s have looked at the molecular data and said there is an awful lot of stuff there that has very little to do with natural selection, that genes come and go, and sometimes if they pan out, you'll see their frequencies increase, but more often they just disappear. The ones that are parts of the common makeup of the organisms that are there are probably ones that are fixed through natural selection at that point. But in terms of the change of that genome, very little of it is actually the subject of selection. I put pre-adaptations there simply because pre-adaptation suggests that, again, this idea of a progressive change. And so anything that's been created in some different way in the past and suddenly gets co-opted, as Gould and Verba put it, or exapted for a new function, or contingency adduction in our area is meant to capture the same sense. That pre-adaptation sense is that it's headed for somewhere. Now these are just arguments and growling points within evolutionary biology. Without biology, or without science for that matter, we also have people who say, well, evolutionary theory, we can come up with any account because there really are no facts. It's theory, and theory is just a social construct, as though it's floating off in space, devoid of any real content. In the idea of creationism, and this is something that has been rearing itself again, it's in accord with that fixed species view of a lot of the previous biologists, and so they can point to a point in time in history, in biology history, that says, well, this is good biological thinking. The new creation science, in fact, has some of the trappings of science and say, since scientific theories are social constructs anyway, this is our construct, and we're going to take a different data set. We'll account for some of the facts that these people have, but we're also going to take the revealed truth of the Bible or of other religious documents, and these facts, we're going to bring them into accord with that, and our theory is just as valid. It's just speculation like yours, but ours has the force of God and our faith behind it. I borrowed a quote from Gilbert and Sullivan. They present a bunch of details meant to lend an air of verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. It really has become that way. In response to all that, and in the summary of the points in this presentation, I would suggest that if you want to take some action and become better informed, one of the things I would suggest you do is to read Darwin just for the heck of it. It is fun to read. Darwin was really perceptive. Some of his insights were brilliant. It's not of much current use in the sense of having current biological information, but it tells you how we got where we are, and it does it in a way that really has a human face to it, or a human sense. It's not sanitized writing. It's very closely tied to his experience as a naturalist. Study some basic biology. If you want to know about evolution and you think it's important, then study it. And start off with basic biology. Better yet, take some genetics, physiology, anatomy, physiology, systematics, all these things. Take as much biology as you can, because that's the only way you're ever going to understand the real power of this model. If nothing else, if you're just a well-educated layperson, be adamant about the fact of evolution. There is no question that evolution has taken place. It's a fact. And be clear about what a theory is in science, that it's not just speculation that has its equivalence in any other speculation, that it's a formal way of bringing together data that we've derived empirically. And with that, I'll let you be. Thank you. Thank you.